Hey, it's a blessing to be here with you. The work of Carolina Movement is really important. I get to see just about everything going on across the country, from networks to denominations to different things. And I couldn't be more excited about what's happening at Carolina Movement, the vision, the idea of gospel saturation, getting to every county. I think that not only could what's happening here be a defining moment for North Carolina, but the model that's being used is starting very slowly to trickle out to other states and other geographies. So I think this isn't just about what happens in North Carolina. It's about setting sort of the footing for what happens in other places. I want to thank the team at Carolina Movement with Chris, with Corey, and Colin. It's just been amazing to work with them, and I don't think you know how blessed you are to have passionate leaders that are helping pull things together the way they're doing it. So I think we ought to actually give them a hand for doing things. At the very last slide that I'm going to have up, there's a barcode for the resources. This slide deck I'm going to use is in there. The video that's going to play is there, so you don't need to worry about taking a whole bunch of notes if you'd rather just look at the QR code that's at the end of things. Corey said I've been in the Navy. Some of you may have never heard of this before, but when a large metal ship sits in the water, you might ask, how does it not corrode through the hull of a large ship? And it's because there's a thing called sacrificial anodes. They're the size of a brick or smaller, and right below the waterline of a large aircraft carrier, cruiser, battleship, are these brick-sized things called sacrificial anodes, that they're the thing that corrodes and gets eaten away instead of the hull of the ship. So I have the privilege of being the sacrificial anode for the Carolina Movement Gathering this year. And here's what I mean by that. Chris got to come out and rah-rah the vision for sending. And Corey's going to come out tomorrow and rah-rah the call to do things. And Andrew Hopper's going to remind us that we got to keep things moving. And guess what assignment I get? Being a sending church is not an easy thing. So I get to be the person who brings you, I'd like to say, if they're the buns on the side of the meat, I actually get to bring you the meat. Like, what's it really take to get this thing where you guys want it to go? I want to start with this playing off of something that Chris said. He challenged you to not just plant churches, but send people. Most of you don't know it, but in your midst right now, he's here. Ralph Moore is with us today. And if you don't know who Ralph Moore is, when Chris referred to Viral Churches, a book that Stetzer and Bird did a number of years ago, they only found one viral church in all of the United States. And it was Ralph Moore's. And he's here today. So I was asking Ralph this morning, tell me about the churches you planted and this idea of sending and what it looked like. And Ralph told me right off the bat, oh my goodness, like one time we sent 25% of our congregation to plant. 4 times we sent 20% of our congregation to plant. Now here's the fun part about the numbers about being a sending church, is Ralph and his church directly planted 80 churches over the last 50 years or more. 80 churches. But here's the real blessing. They know they can count 2,639 churches that are part of those 80 churches' spiritual lineage of generational impact. But here's what's really good. That's only a tenth probably of what's happened. Once you get 2 or 3 generations in the future, you lose track of what's happening. So I want to encourage you with this challenge that Chris has given you to not just plant, but to send people. Ralph told me that, yeah, it's hard, but in all 5 of those cases where they sent 20% or more of their church, almost immediately within months, the attendance was back where it was before they did it. He said there was a little bit of a delay that you then have to disciple the new people to get the giving back where it was. And there's only a little delay to that. He said the more traumatic thing is the leadership issue of it, that a lot of times the people who go are the leaders. But he said it's all worth it, especially with the daisy chain of what happens. So I am going to try to move fairly quickly today to keep us on track. I want to start with a really simple definition of ascending church. It should be up on the screen if the screen is working. And you can literally make up your own definition. I'm going to give you the working definition we're using for today. Ascending church is a church that has changed its scorecard to measure success not by what they accumulate, but by why they send, from everyday missionaries close to home to church planters in new geographies. And what I want to highlight in that definition is that the scorecard part of it, the personal scorecard, is really what we're going to focus on in this session. It might be easy for you right now to say, oh yeah, we need a church scorecard that's all about church planting and sending and how we get sending capacity greater than. But the challenge is really not the church scorecard. The church scorecard's really easy. The challenge is our personal scorecards. I apologize, my notes were getting messed up there. What I'm going to do as we go through this today is I'm going to tell you a couple of stories, a couple of local church stories, both of which are people who are just like you sitting in the audience, small churches actually, not large, well-resourced churches. And I want to show you what I'm talking about on the surrender piece as we go through. Let's start with Matthew 6:19 through 21, a verse that you've looked at lots of times before. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there is your heart will also be. There's two things I want you to take away from this for our talk today. The first is the paradox that if you really do the logic behind this verse, it's talking about storing up and not storing up. It's talking about treasure. But here's the paradox. In order to store up treasures in heaven, what do we have to do on earth? It's telling us don't store up on earth. So what's the opposite? It's to deploy on earth. So that's the paradox of this whole sending church thing, is that if we're going to have a church scorecard and we're not going to root it in treasures on earth, but we're going to root it in treasures in eternity of lost people reached and things, the paradox is the only way to get there is to deploy on earth. And what does it mean to deploy? Does it mean preaching on Sunday? Yes. Does it mean Sunday-centric? Maybe. Does it mean small groups? Maybe. There's no way that any of us can come up with a definition of deploying on earth that doesn't have the word sending in it, that doesn't have the idea that we are releasing things beyond the walls of our church, that we are letting go of control of things beyond the walls of our church. That's the paradox of this storing up treasures piece. The second part's found in the last part of the verse. For where your treasure is, your heart will also be. That's the challenge that I can't deliver on for you today. The issue of being ascending church is all about your scorecard, not your church's scorecard. It's about your scorecard. And your scorecard is a heart issue. You are the biggest obstacle to being ascending church. I'm just going to be the bad guy. Remember, I'm the sacrificial anode. You are the problem of why you're not more of ascending church. Trust me, I don't care how many churches you're planting. You are the problem. Your scorecard needs to be worked on. And that's what we're going to talk today. That's why I get the dirty work of what's it take to get there. It's a personal heart issue of what our scorecards look like. So the core questions I want you to go into this thinking about. The first question is, how much is my personal scorecard holding us back? The second question is, what do I need to change in my personal scorecard? And as we go through the stories we're going to talk about here in this session quickly, I really want you to I'm going to ask you not to think about your church. I'm going to ask you to think about you. What does it take for you to be faithful with little, to be trusted with much? What does it look like for you to be a 3-talent person or a 5-talent person and risk it all? Risking every bit of it. That's not a church issue. That is a personal scorecard, personal heart issue, and that's what we're talking about today. I'm going to start with the first story, the story of my home church. Corey mentioned it, New Life Christian Church, Centerville, Virginia. You've got the quote on the wall. I'm going to start a church, planting church, and I don't know how, but we're going to figure it out. Brett Andrews is the founding pastor. If I ask for you to show of hands who knows Brett, I'm guessing nobody in the room knows Brett. Okay? In 1988, Brett said to me, we became good friends when I was still in the marketplace. He was 22 years old and said, I'm going to start a church planting church. Come help me with it. And I said, what's that mean? What's it mean to be a church planting church? And he said, I don't know. We're going to figure it out. And I said, well, how do you be a church planting church? He said, I don't know. We're going to figure it out. Fast forward the clock 30 years. New Life has 340 some churches in its spiritual line of churches. They've put millions of dollars into church planting. They founded Passion for Planting, founded Exponential, have impacted tens of thousands of churches. And the story you're going to hear is it's not about some grand vision. It's not about some grand strategy. It is about one leader with a surrendered scorecard to say, we are going to have a kingdom scorecard, not a local church scorecard. It's going to be about the kingdom scorecard. So here's the story of New Life. 1988, Brett said, I'm going to do it. It was 1993 when he started. Him and his wife, a few $1,000s and a savings account and 7 people in a living room. And it was hard. It was hard for a couple of years. Within 3 years, they were financially self-sufficient where they could take a deep breath. They didn't have their own building, didn't have their own facility, took a deep breath and basically said, okay, what's next? And many of the people in the church wanted to buy land and get a building. And Brett Andrews said, nope, if we're going to be a church planting church, we will not build or acquire our first building until we've planted our first church. We will not have it unless God gives it to us until we do it. And not only that, the first staff person we're going to hire is going to be a resident to plant our first church. So just imagine you've just gotten financially self-sufficient where you know you're going to survive. You're running less than 200 people, and you've now gotten financially self-sufficient. We had 2.5 FTEs of staff at that point, including a church planting resident. And going into year 4, Brett said it's time to plant. We let 1.5 FTEs of staff, everyone except the lead pastor, go plant the first church, and about 40% of the budget. And on the heels of that, we started asking the question, how are we going to get to 1 a year? If we're really going to be a church planting church, how do we get to 1 a year? That was the common theme through the next 20 years. How are we going to? How are we going to? How are we going to? I want to reiterate, there was no grand strategy. There was no big vision. All there was a lead pastor who said, our scorecard is going to be faithful with little, faithful with much, trusting that God will take care of the details when we go. And fortunately, we didn't get stuck in the someday whens. We really lived as if someday is today. If you think Joshua 24:15, I think it is, where Joshua gives the declarative, as for me and my household, we will trust the Lord. What New Life Christian Church did for 30 years was a continual string of declaratives. We will tithe to church planting. That's the part I forgot to tell you. When the church was 5 years old, made the commitment, we will tithe to church planting, 10% right off the top every year, and we're going to increase it 1% every year after that. And I'm not talking a mega church here that has a lot of money. We're talking a church now that's still under 300 people that from the beginning is doing that. I get asked on a regular basis, what's it take to be a reproducing church? What do we have to do to be a sending church? If we really want to be a vibrant sending church, what do we have to do? And it's a painful, well, you don't have to do this completely, but my answer is normally, it's really simple. You're one decision away. One decision from being a vibrant sending church. Go back to your elders tonight, have a meeting, and commit 10% to church planting. Might sound crazy, like no way we could do that. But here's the deal. Everyone in this room has preached tithing to people in your church. We don't have any problem calling people to action for tithing. But the question is, what's the tithe look like in our church? What is the first fruit of where our first fruits are going as a church? And if the answer is it's internal things, then we've got, something to look at. This someday when phenomena, usually the someday when is where someday when we have the money, we'll plant a church. Someday when we have the building paid off, we'll plant a church. Someday when we've got the staff. And here's the challenge. Someday never comes for 93% of churches. That's a statistical fact. Someday never comes for 93% of churches. And the question is, what's it look like for us to move past being the someday when part? I'm going to suggest to you that we have an operating system problem, which is a talk for a whole nother day. And here's what I mean by the operating system. At Exponential, we developed this level 5 framework. The level 5 framework is simply a math framework. So if you take basic math, subtraction, addition, multiplication, and if you look at the 3 circles, that's like the Olympic rings. Between subtraction and addition is plateau. So if you just start with subtraction, plateau, and addition, that's like the bell curve of life. All of us go through. We're born, we grow, we plateau, and eventually we die. So 100% of living organisms, including churches, exist on this chart of what you're seeing at level 1, 2, and 3 at any given time. Your church right now is a level 1, 2, or 3 church. You can go look at the characteristics and you're a level 1, 2, or 3 church, every single one of us in here today. Just like human reproduction, levels 4 and 5, reproduction and multiplication, not all humans reproduce, not all churches reproduce. I'm going to suggest to you that throughout all history, the studies that have been done in recent years, and you're seeing on the chart, about 35% of churches are subtracting, about 35% are plateaued, and about 30% are adding. If we want to just call it 33, 33, 33, about a third of churches are subtracting, about a third of churches are plateaued, and about a third of churches are adding. It's probably been that way for 2,000 years. It's the bell curve of life, and everything has a season. But the downside or the problem we've got that we've got to work on relative to the sending church piece is that multiple studies over the last 8 years now, less than 7% of U.S. churches are reproducing or multiplying. And if you look at the statistics of how do we get to even keeping up with population increase, this number has to increase if we're going to see gospel saturation and see things moving forward. And when I say we have an operating system problem, I want you on this next slide to imagine right at level 3, which is the growth orientation of church where we focus on growth. I want you to picture the operating system of church as like a magnet that sits at level 3. If you're at level 1 or 2, who wants to be at level 1 or 2 if you can be at level 3? Why would you want to be subtracting or plateaued if you could be adding? The entire church consulting industry is about getting you to level 3. But you've got to think of our current operating system as a church as a magnet. If you do the right formula, you get the right staff, you have the right programs, you've got the right building, you've got the right strategy. I hate to tell you, you don't have to be a Christian to grow a megachurch. Just let it sink in. You don't have to be a Christian to grow a megachurch. Follow the formula. And the formula is the left side of that magnet. The consulting world knows how to do it. Go do all the right things and you're going to get there. Here's our problem. Magnets pull both ways. The very things that get us to level 3 hold us back from level 4 and 5. That is the consumer-driven operating system of the U.S. church. Saddleback Sam and Sally are customers that need to be served, and everything else falls in place. Our buildings, our programs, our staff, everything about it falls in line with how do we get to a growth orientation. And here's the deal. Every one of those things, the $11.2 million building debt, is a someday when problem. Someday when we don't have that mortgage debt, we'll get over there to level 4 and 5 and plant churches. Someday when we figure out the staffing problem, we'll move over there on the right side of the magnet. Every magnet pulls both ways. The very things that get us to level 3 hold us back from level 4 and 5. And here's the challenge. That's not a church problem. It's your scorecard. It's my scorecard. We are conditioned, and our identities as pastors are flagged by the left side of what's happening on that magnet. Who doesn't want to be on the fastest, largest, most innovative church list with Outreach Magazine? We know what the scorecard is for the left side. And unfortunately, if we don't break through it and get scorecards on the right side, we're going to be in trouble. Here's what I want to do. I want you to think about the left side of the magnet, metaphorically, is like a giant lake. As a church, we might be a lake church that's trying to get a bigger and bigger inflow to make the lake bigger of things coming in. And there's nothing flowing out. Now think about a river. If we break open the dam on that lake and we let all the water start flowing out, now we've got a river. I want you to think of the left side at level 1, 2, and 3 as a lake church. The right side is a river church. And what we're going to do is we're going to watch a video right now of Larry Walkemeyer. It's our second story today. Larry leads a church in Long Beach, California, Light and Life Fellowship. He went there in 1991, and I'm going to let him tell the story, and then we'll come back and talk some more.
I'm Larry Walkemeyer, and I'm here to tell you a story. It's a God story. It's a story of what the Lord has done in a church called Light and Life Christian Fellowship. I'm a Kansas farm boy originally, and went to the West Coast to the big LA area, and eventually became lead pastor in a little place in North Long Beach with a handful of white people. I'd never been a pastor before, and I didn't know what the heck I was doing, but I had this dream of growing this little church into mega church, because this was the era of church growth. And I had learned and sunk my teeth into this church growth thinking. And so when I came to North Long Beach and looked around at 39 parking spots, I was a bit discouraged. I was like, thanks a lot, God. How am I going to grow a church with 39 parking spots? Because the book that I had just read, which was the #1 book on church growth at the time, said to grow your church, you need ample and convenient parking. And I looked at our 39 spots and said, this is going to be tough. God, how are we going to do this? Plus, we were a very diverse neighborhood filled with gangs and violence, and right next to Compton, California, if no Compton. I said, Lord, we're going to really need your help. And the Lord began to help us in wonderful ways. And we began to make those changes that would help us begin to grow this handful of white folks into a larger church. We began, for one thing, prayer walking our neighborhood and praying this prayer: Lord, help our church look like our neighborhood. And we began to ask the question, how can we serve our neighbors? And people began to come, and we changed our worship style. We got rid of the hymns and got the courses, and we decorated our church differently, and the sermons were different. We simplified our church government structure, and we started doing those things that would really be attractive to the seeker. And so we became this attractional church, and God began to help us in wonderful ways, and the church began to grow dynamically. In fact, from 1991, when I came to that church, over the next 7 years, we grew into a church of about 800 people and still only had 39 parking spots. We multiplied services. We were running golf carts around the neighborhood to pick up people. And my dream of becoming a megachurch was coming true. And I was ready to relocate the church to a bigger, safer area with lots of parking, lots of seating, and fulfill this dream. But my wife, who more spiritual than me, said, honey, before we make such a big decision and try and raise millions of dollars for this relocation, maybe we ought to go away and pray about this. And so I said, no, we don't need to do that. No, I didn't. I said, let's do that, honey. And so we went away for a week and began to pray. And we got into the Word. We fasted. And separately, God led us to the same chapter in the Old Testament, Ezekiel 47, And in that vision that Ezekiel has there, there's a temple. And out of the east side of the temple, there's a trickle that flows out, that becomes a brook, that becomes a stream, that becomes a mighty river. And the Lord revealed to us separately that we had become a lake church where people flowed in and we kept everyone in. And the lake was getting bigger and bigger. People flowed in around one pastor and built one vision mine and gave to one budget. And everybody was volunteering to help build the lake. And we did everything we could to keep them in. And that's why we needed to relocate. But the Lord said, no, wait. I've got a different vision for you. It's a vision where people would flow to the church, but then flow out. And it might start small, but it would become bigger and bigger as it multiplied. And so the Lord gave us this vision. And in Ezekiel 47:9, it says, Larry, if you will do this, it says, where the river flows, everything will live. And so Deb and I came back with this vision and began to communicate this vision. And it was tough. I got to tell you, it was tough. Because the year before, we had just won the plaque for being the fastest growing church in the nation for our denomination. And I told the people, we're going to win the plaque again next year. And it was all about the plaque. But we came back and said, no, we're going to start giving away people, raising up leaders, gathering people around them, and then sending them out. The river is going to flow. And we might not become bigger as a church, but the kingdom will become bigger. Our council may stay the same size, but God's kingdom can grow. But there was something inside of me that resisted that, because my ego liked the idea of addition, of growing a big church, because the American church really rewards bigger the better, the bigger buildings, the bigger attendance, the bigger budgets. And so inside, I had to give up this dream and trust God in ways that really were uncomfortable. In fact, the Lord said, Larry, unless you will die to yourself, you won't multiply my church. You'll never carry this vision out. And he showed me the verse where he says, unless a seed falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it will bear much fruit. And so I had to do that work internally of dying to my own ego and pride. There were fears that came up. I knew what it was to grow a church, but I didn't know what it was to send people out and to plant a church. I'd never planted a church before. I'd revitalized this one, but I'd never planted a church before. And so there were these fears of what's going to happen financially to us if we start giving away people and tithers, and would we be able to really pay our bills, for example? And so there was that tension. And I knew also there was this fear of conflict. I'm a people pleaser. I don't like conflict. To cast this vision of, hey, we're going to send leaders and people out the door, I knew that our current board and leadership were going to be opposed to that. And so I was facing this fear of conflict as well. And I knew it would mean sacrifices other ways because, for example, we wanted to upgrade our facility, and we still had residential track lighting for our stage lighting, if you can believe that. And my dream was, hey, I want us just to get some stage lighting and a better sound system and look like a real church. And it came down to saying, you're going to have to put that desire off for a couple of years if you're going to invest in church planting. And I had to die to those kind of tensions and things inside of me, like, okay, Lord, the dream, it's a different scorecard. The dream is to multiply and to flow. So Deb and I came back and we cast this vision of this river church, and we began to build a different kind of culture. We didn't know what to do, but we knew that we needed to pray. We knew how to do that. And so we called 40 days of fasting and prayer to launch the river vision. And almost everybody in the church fasted and prayed for those 40 days, fasted something. Myself and a few other leaders fasted all food for 40 days and just intensely sought the Lord. We would have all-night prayer meetings. We'd lock ourselves in the sanctuary for 24 hours straight and just pray, and people would flow in and pray with us. And we were saying, God, we don't know how to start a river church, but we believe you've called us to this, and you're going to have to supply this and do this. And the Lord began to unveil the next steps. And the first step surprised me because the Lord said to me and to Deb, we'd been leading a Bible study down in our neighborhood, which was in Long Beach, but about 20 minutes away, very different demographic than North Long Beach where the church was. And the Lord said, Larry, if you're going to start planting churches, maybe you should plant the first one. I said, Lord, I'm preaching 3 or 4 services on Sunday morning. How can I do that? He said, well, what about Sunday night? And Deb and I decided, well, we could take this neighborhood group and some volunteers from our church on Sunday evenings and launch the first church plant out of Light and Life. And so that's what we did. And the Lord blessed that and began to grow that. And so the river had started flowing, and pretty soon I raised somebody up to take that church plant. And we began this model of having people within the body feel a call to plant a church. We'd raise them up. We'd let them preach and say, hey, Brian's going to go plant a church in 8 to 12 months. And some of you, in fact, many of you are going to be called to go with Brian. And you pray about that as Brian preaches. And so we began to raise up these leaders and launch out people. Sometimes the groups were smaller, 30 or 40 people would go. Sometimes they were as much as 25% of the church would walk out the door on church planting Sunday. But we begin to see this river begin to flow into different communities. Now we were in an area where within a 20-minute circumference, there were 2 million people that needed the gospel of Jesus. And so we would say, hey, you can plant 5 minutes away. You can plant 10 minutes away. We weren't territorial. We just wanted to see the gospel go out and new churches be planted in these underserved communities. So this was the vision. We began to see the culture of our church begin to focus on not gathering, but on sending. Now, as we did this, there were many rough spots. There were times when the money was too short. Deb and I took pay cuts on three different times because of what it cost to keep the river flowing. But God was always faithful. I remember him saying that, Larry, you can outgive me. And now a mantra in our church is, you can't outgive God. In fact, one time we were baptizing people, and we were short $30,000 at that point in our budget. And I was like thinking of money while I was baptizing people. And the first 4 people I baptized were a college student, a person on welfare, a person working the counter at McDonald's, and a senior citizen. And I was like, God, none of these are going to help fund this river model that we have. And the Lord just said, Larry, what are you doing? I said, I'm baptizing people. He said, no, you're complaining against me. You're grumbling against the vision that I've given you. But Larry, if you'll take care of the poor and you'll continue to give away, you will never outgive me. And 3 months later, at the end of our fiscal year, we ended up not 30,000 in the red, but 30,000 in the black. This was the kind of provision that God gave to us. We changed culture. We got a new mission statement. Our new mission statement that everybody in the church could say was reach, teach, mend, and send. And it was like our cheer at our church. We changed the logo to involve the river. We did everything we could to begin to embed a new culture of sending and multiplication in our church. And the Lord began to move and just raise up. Every year, we would plant 1 or 2 churches in this hive-off model. Now, we did send some like to Philadelphia or Hawaii. Everybody wished they could go to Hawaii, but we would send most of our church plants without out in a 20-minute circumference of the church. And the Lord caused that river to get deeper. And you know what you notice about the river in Ezekiel 47 is that it starts out ankle deep, knee deep, then waist deep. But then it becomes an uncrossable river, a river that's over the head, a river where you are no longer in control, but you are being carried along by the current of the river. You have to be willing to go wherever the river flows. And so it was this continual surrender to the Spirit to say, Holy Spirit, this is your river of life that you want to bring places where there's death. Because where the river flows, everything will live. And as the river began to flow, there were these distributaries, they're called. Distributaries. That's where the river branches off into places and brings life to different places. And this began to happen because our churches weren't just planted, they began to plant churches as well. And these distributaries begin to raise up life-giving, everyday missionaries who begin to take the gospel into their own neighborhoods. And ministers, we would wash the feet of people when we'd send them formally out. We've washed over 50 feet of people, not church planters, but just ministers going into some formal kind of ministry, whether it was Washington, D.C. and Capitol Hill, or whether it was leading parachurch ministries somewhere. The river was flowing and distributing itself in different places. We raised up campuses as distributaries, and our church plants started planting churches and branching out that way. You see, what made the difference for me was when I switched from lake thinking to river thinking. When the scorecard changed from how big can it be around me to what can we release for the glory of the name of Jesus. When it became not about my castle, but about God's kingdom. When it became not about how can we get people into our church, but how can we get the gospel into every crook and crevice and cranny of our city, of our community, of our ministry area. When it became about gospel saturation, giving people this opportunity to meet Jesus personally. That was the river flowing. And so my prayer for you is that more and more you would think gospel, you would think kingdom, you would think river instead of lake, because this is the way we're going to see the most people come in to the kingdom of God and know Jesus as Savior and Lord. May you be a river Christian, a river leader, a river church. God bless you.
I don't know about you, that video for me, and if Brett Andrews, the first story, if he were doing the same video, you'd be hearing the same kind of thing. It's simultaneously for me, like, I'm going to use the word exhilarating. It's like, imagine the impact to lostness in North Carolina if every one of us had that scorecard. I'm not exaggerating. The ripple effect of that kind of surrendered scorecard is what changes and transforms entire geographies. And then I'm also at the same time, it's really scary. Having been a former executive pastor, and I put myself in the shoes of every step along the way, man, those are hard decisions. Those are hard decisions. So it's like this, on one hand, exhilarating, and on the other hand, exhausting. And that's what makes this journey of our personal scorecards hard, is we can know in our head the right answer, but then, boy, is it hard. Here's what I'd like to share in the rest of the time. I asked Larry, Larry's been a friend for a while, Larry and about 14 other strong lead pastors of sending churches. So I got about 15 different churches to input based on this idea of river and lake church. What are the top characteristics that they would encourage you all with that are 2 or 3 things that it takes to get that kind of scorecard. And so what I'm going to share with you is just, it was kind of uncanny. The 15 or so that I got back, it was very easy to condense them down to 3 things, which said something about the feedback from them. The first one I'll call shift 1, which is a conviction shift. This is where what we're talking about on scorecard, it's got to start with our scorecards changing. We have a really clear picture for this. Larry calls it the plaque. He was driven by the plaque, getting that award of the largest growing thing. That's a scorecard issue. His words were also kingdom over castle. I had to shift from my castle to a kingdom perspective. I remember Brett Andrews saying for years in our early days, and I didn't understand what he was talking about. He would say, I don't want a local church scorecard. I want a kingdom scorecard. He just, and then I'd say, well, what does that mean? He'd say, I just want it to be about something way bigger than what we're doing locally. I want us to be doing something locally, but I want us to be a part of something bigger. And that drove lots of decisions. So the conviction where we've got to shift the scorecard. And again, I want to say that's a personal issue, not a church issue to start with. In Deuteronomy 17, 16, and 17, this verse has always messed me up a little bit. This is Moses telling the Israelites when they want a king in the future. So it's in advance. When you want a king in the future, here's what you need to look for in a king. The king must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or take too many wives, or accumulate large amounts of gold and silver. We got to ask ourselves, what's that all about? Think about your staffing requirements and the job descriptions you put together. Does anybody here have a job requirement that the staff you're hiring shall not be focused on accumulation? Just let it sink in. Most of our job descriptions are about accumulation. Moses is telling the people, the future king should not be focused on accumulation. Why? Because you'll take your eyes off Jesus. In our case, the left side of that magnet, the lake priorities, take our eyes off the stuff on the right side, and we got to get them reshuffled. The second big shift, I call it a courage shift in the feedback from everyone. If the first one was a personal scorecard, that's the easy one. The second one that's hard is what I'm titling the courage shift. And at the core of this one, you can go the metaphor, follow the money. At the core of the courage shift, and Larry highlighted it, there's really probably 3 core things. It's the fear of the money part, what happens to us financially. There's the fear of the power or control part of what happens. There's the, I guess it's the money, the power, and then the ego part of it, the pride part of it. So Larry identified, and you guys can get these for free in one of his ebooks. He identified like 20 different personal scorecard issues, and we're not going through them all, but I'd encourage you to get his free ebook, Flow, where he documents this whole journey. And he identifies all these things he had to put to death. And he describes them as the combination of, at their core, he was fearful. Fear was driving everything. And that's why I call this shift a shift from fear to a shift of courage. We can, in our heads, have the conviction that we need a new scorecard, but in our hearts, if we go back to that accumulate verse when Jesus said earlier in Matthew 6:19, it's a heart issue that we've got to overcome to put all these kinds of things to death that Larry's identified here. He highlighted the John 12:24, truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it must remain alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. That's really, Larry hit it. That's the core of these first 2 shifts, the conviction and the posture part of the second. The third is where we now get to turn to our churches. And the feedback that I collected from the different sending church pastors, this is more where we get into the behavior side. It's the shift from seating capacity to sending capacity. I'd really say it's our shift in behaviors. I like to use this model called the culture alignment model. It's on the previous slide. Culture in your church or in anything is the alignment of our values with our language, with our behaviors. okay? Our values with our language, with our behaviors. Values are not what we do. Values shape how we do everything we do. That's why it's at the center of the circle here. You could go back and almost name Larry Walkemeyer's values, the things that shape everything. Language, look what Larry did in the language side. They changed their logo, their vision, their mission, their tagline, the things they celebrate. Once they went after this alignment of a new culture, it changed everything in their language. But here's the deal. Values and language by themselves are nothing. It's the behavior part we've got to get to. So what's it mean to change our behaviors as sending churches? And that's really, as we're talking as a community here, a community with a cause, of what's it mean to be a sending church, I'm going to suggest to you that there's 4 different categories that you can think about as a sending church. If you just think about trying to hit in the center of multiplication, the next slide if we can, funding people, care, and services. Just about anything you can do as a sending church. Let's take the really easy one, putting money into church planting. You could put money in and do nothing else. Or the people part, which Chris is challenging all of us to, not only being planters, but sending teams of people. We can do something in the people part, the care of the teams that we're mobilizing, and then services mean everything from doing bookkeeping for our church plants to helping them with marketing to giving them equipment that we don't need anymore. I'm just going to suggest to you that just about anything you could come up with as a sending church to help the plants that are going out fit into one of these categories of money, people and teams, services, or care. And here's what I want to encourage you with. Don't be overwhelmed by Brett Andrews and Larry Walkemeyer's story. It can start with one thing on this chart. It can start with you're not currently giving money, so you give some money. It could start with how do we increase 1% what we're giving. The key is taking some next step.